I said I needed to go, and I went. I left everything behind. I hid. When I pressed the button to end the last video, the weight of reality hit me like a hammer. I wasn't safe. No more, if I ever was. I left where I was without looking back. I took the first dirt road I found and drove aimlessly, without a destination, with only one certainty: it needed to disappear. Now, I'm here, in a place I don't even know if I can call home. An abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. The smell of rotting wood and damp earth fills the air. The wind blows hard outside, making the leaves on the trees whisper a warning that I already understand. I know they are looking for me. It was exactly as they warned me. After I revealed those documents about the Vatican blacklist, things changed. First, it was the stairs in public places, then the cars parked in front of my house for hours, and finally, the silent phone calls in the middle of the night. Subtle but clear signs for those who know how to interpret. The church has long arms, eyes everywhere, and a memory that spans centuries they don't forget, never. The case of this pope that I'm going to report now is directly connected to what I showed last time. A man who reached the top of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, who held the keys to the kingdom in his hands, but who made the fatal mistake. He wanted to change the system from within. Celestine V, the hermit pope, the only one who voluntarily resigned before Benedict XVI. A simple man, a monk who never wanted power, but who was crowned against his will. And do you know how long his papacy lasted? Just 5 months. 5 months before being forced to abdicate. The history books will say that he resigned due to incompetence, lack of preparation, lie. What I found in the secret files tells a very different story. Celestino discovered something in the basements of the Vatican, something so disturbing that it made him want to abandon everything. And what happened to him afterwards? He was protected by his successor, Boniface VIII, isolated in a stone tower, held as a prisoner until his suspicious death, conveniently classified as natural. Most frighteningly, these documents reveal a hidden power structure that transcends the Vatican itself, an alliance between religious and political forces that controls much more than we imagine. The same structure that now forces me to live like a fugitive, jumping from one hiding place to another, recording these videos in precarious conditions. You can't imagine what I found when deciphering the codes in Celestino's letters. References to a group calling themselves the Guardians of the Seal, a secret order within the Vatican responsible for preserving certain knowledge and eliminating those who threaten to expose it. They are the ones who keep the blacklist updated. They are the ones who decide who lives and who dies. What I'm about to reveal may cost me my life, but I can no longer keep it to myself. I need to share before it's too late, before they find me. If something happens to me after this video, you will already know why, and they will have the clues to continue this investigation. If this content is resonating with you, please leave a like now. Each interaction strengthens this message and protects it from being silenced. Your participation is not just support. It is a shield against those who want this information to disappear. What I found about Celestino V, or Pietro Angelerio as he was known, before his coronation, reveals a man profoundly different from the popes who surrounded him in history. Living as a hermit in the Abruzzo mountains, Pietro never sought power or influence. He was a thin man with a long beard and piercing eyes who spent his days in prayer, fasting and meditation inside a small cave he called home. Records show that he often went days without speaking to anyone, communicating only with God. An existence that the cardinals of Rome, with their luxurious robes and endless banquets, could barely comprehend. When they sent him the letter informing him of his election as Pope in 1294, it is said that Pietro tried to flee. Imagine this. A man so devout that his first reaction upon being chosen as Christ's representative on earth was to run in the opposite direction. The documents I discovered, hidden in the catacombs of the Vatican's secret library, show desperate letters in which Pietro begged to be relieved of this responsibility. "I am but a simple man," he wrote, "without knowledge of the intrigues of the court or the languages of the learned. How could I guide Peter's boat through these stormy waters?" But the church was in crisis. The papal throne had been vacant for more than 2 years. With the cardinals divided into factions fighting for power, they needed someone who was above dispute, a figure of unquestionable purity, and who better than a hermit known for his holiness. They didn't want a leader. They wanted a symbol, a puppet they could control. The accounts of the day of his coronation are revealing. As the crowd celebrated in the streets of Aquila, witnesses describe Pietro as a man in agony, trembling under the weight of his papal robes. A cardinal present wrote in his diary, "His eyes were like those of a hunted animal seeking a way out." This was not a man assuming power. This was a prisoner being chained. In the early days of his papacy, Celestine tried to keep his life simple. He refused to occupy the palace's luxurious apartments, preferring a small wooden cell built within his official quarters. He ate only bread and vegetables, drinking water instead of the fine wine offered. The cardinals tolerated these eccentricities at first, but their patience soon ran out when they realized that they would not be able to manipulate him as they had hoped. What happened behind the scenes during those 5 months of the papacy is where the official story and the truth I discovered diverge drastically. Public records speak of an incompetent pope, unable to deal with bureaucracy and easily influenced. But the secret letters I found tell a different story, that of a man horrified by what he discovered in the papal archives. One letter in particular, written by Celestine to his friend and confessor, recounts his discovery of a sealed safe in the basements of the Vatican, guarded by a door with 7 locks, each with a key held by one of the 7 cardinals of the inner circle, a group that is never mentioned in any official church document. The contents of this safe disturbed Celestino so much that his words in the letter are cautious, written in a code that took me months to decipher. "What I found contradicts everything our faith professes," he wrote. "If the faithful knew what really lurks beneath the altar of St. Peter, the church would collapse in a single day." Celestine mentioned documents dating back to the 3rd century, evidence of a great replacement, and references to guardians, protecting primordial knowledge from before the founding of Rome. After this discovery, Celestino's behavior changed drastically. He began asking the cardinals uncomfortable questions about ancient rituals and abandoned practices, tried to access sealed catacombs beneath the Basilica of St. John Lateran, and, most alarmingly for the inner circle, he began drafting a papal bull that was never published, a document that, according to my findings, was intended to expose the whole truth to the Christian world. It was then that the siege began to close. Cardinal Benedetto Caetani, who would later become Pope Boniface VIII, approached Celestino as an advisor and friend. Records show frequent private meetings between the two. At each meeting, witnesses report that Celestino left paler and more shaken. He was being prepared for his own destruction. Most revealing is a document I found hidden inside a false cover of a liturgical book, a transcription of a conversation between Celestino and Caetani, secretly made by a scribe monk hidden behind a false wall. In it, Caetani leaves no doubt. "Holy Father, there is knowledge that is not for everyone. Some truths must remain hidden for the sake of faith. If you insist on this path, I will not be able to guarantee your safety or your soul." It was a direct threat, and it worked. 2 weeks later, Celestine V announced his resignation, the first and only pope to do so voluntarily until Benedict XV, more than 700 years. Later, the official reason, incompetence and a desire to return to the contemplative life. The truth, terror at what he discovered and the consequences of exposing it. What happened next is even more disturbing. Celestino tried to escape, to return to his life as a hermit, but Boniface VIII, now Pope, ordered his capture. "For your own protection," the official document said. In reality, Celestino was kept prisoner in a tower in the castle of Fumone, in a cell so small that he could barely lie down. The records I found suggest he was slowly poisoned with regular doses of arsenic in his food. 10 months later, Celestino was dead. The church declared that he died of natural causes, but a secret report I discovered, written by the doctor who examined his body, mentions strange dark spots on the abdomen and an unusual coloring of the lips and fingernails, classic signs of arsenic poisoning. The pattern is clear to anyone with eyes to see. Anyone who threatens to expose the Vatican's deepest secrets meets the same fate. And now, as I write these words hidden in this abandoned place, I know I could be next. But the truth needs to be known, no matter the price. The conclave that led to the election of Celestine V is perhaps one of the most extraordinary and revealing episodes in the secret history of the Vatican. Imagine this. For 2 whole years, from April 1292 to July 1294, the Holy See remained empty. 2 years of chaos, intrigue, bribes and threats. What the history books don't tell you is that this was not a period of pious deliberation, but an open war between powerful families who used religion as a front for their earthly ambitions. The documents I obtained through contacts within the Apostolic Library show a shocking reality. Private correspondence between members of the Colonna and Orsini families, 2 of the most powerful Roman dynasties of the time, reveals a dirty game that would make even the most corrupt politicians of our day blush. Encrypted. Letters exchanged between Cardinal Giacomo Colonna and his brother reveal plans to poison 2 cardinals, favorable to the Orsini. "A little powder in the wine glass," he wrote, "and our troubles will disappear without a trace." On the other side, the Orsini were no less cruel. Financial documents discovered in a secret archive show substantial payments to professional assassins from Venice who specialize in making deaths look like accidents or natural illnesses. 3 Colonna-aligned cardinals and died during that period, all from sudden fevers the doctors at the time could not explain. Most shocking is a scroll I found hidden inside a false wall in the Caetani family's former residence, a list of prices for votes in the conclave. Each cardinal had its value. Some cost lands and titles, others preferred gold, and some, more perverse, asked for young people for their private pleasures. The church that presented itself as the guardian of morals was being auctioned in a market of flesh. And power. Meanwhile, the Christian world suffered. Without a pope, many administrative functions of the church were paralyzed. Important appointments could not be made, theological disputes remained unresolved, and tension grew. The Kingdom of Naples, ruled by the House of Anjou, was particularly concerned about the situation, as it depended on papal support to legitimize its control over territories disputed with Aragon. It was Charles II of Anjou, King of Naples, who finally forced a resolution. Documents recently discovered in French archives show that he even threatened the cardinals with military force if they did not elect a pope quickly. "If the Church cannot govern itself," he wrote in a letter to the College of Cardinals, "then others must intervene for the good of Christendom." This wasn't a gentle suggestion, it was an armed ultimatum, but the impasse seemed impossible to break. 12 cardinals were evenly divided, 6 supporting Colonna interests and 6 aligned. With the Orsini, each side had too much invested to give in, and pride made compromise impossible. It was then that Cardinal Latino Malabranca, Dean of the College of Cardinals, proposed an unexpected solution, electing someone completely outside the system, someone whose sanctity was unquestionable, but whose political inexperience would make him easily manipulated. Latino Malabranca had received a letter from the hermit Pietro Angelerio, an 85-year-old monk who lived in seclusion in the mountains. The letter, which I found preserved in a private collection in Tuscany, contained an alarming prophecy. Peter's throne will remain empty until pride is broken. If a decision is not made quickly, divine punishment will fall on Rome, the likes of which have not been seen since the days of Nero. Pietro wasn't running for the papacy. He was simply warning about a vision he had during his prayers. This letter, presented at the right moment, created a dramatic effect among the superstitious cardinals. Many saw her as a divine sign. Others, more calculating, saw a perfect opportunity, a living saint, venerated by the people, but completely ignorant of the complexities of papal politics. Someone they could control like a puppet, while appearing to have chosen the holiest of men. A fascinating detail I discovered in an anonymous contemporary account suggests that the letter itself may have been forged by Latino Malabranca or altered to create the desired effect. The manuscript mentions a scribe who confessed on his deathbed to having been paid to improve the hermit's words. If this is true, Pietro was manipulated into the papacy before he even knew he was being considered. The unanimity with which Pietro was finally elected hides the true nature of the agreement. Each faction believed it could use the old monk for its own ends. The Colonna saw him as a temporary pope who would pave the way for their own candidate in the future. The Orsini planned to isolate him from outside influences and rule through him. King Charles II of Naples saw an opportunity to have a pope grateful for his elevation and therefore favorable to Angevin interests. No one bothered to ask what Pietro wanted. When a delegation arrived at his cave to inform him of his election, the old monk initially refused. According to witnesses, he fell to his knees, crying and begging to be spared this burden. "I don't know the world or its ways," he said. "I am just a poor servant of God, unworthy and incapable of such responsibility." His reluctance, far from deterring the cardinals, only confirmed to them that they had found the perfect candidate, someone without personal ambition who could be molded as needed. They used theological arguments to convince him refusing would be going against God's will. The Church needed its purity. It was his sacred duty to accept. Finally, exhausted and confused, Pietro gave in. He was taken to the city of Aquila, where a crowd of more than 200,000 people awaited him, a spectacle carefully orchestrated to impress the simple hermit. There, in August 1294, he was crowned Pope Celestine V. What the cardinals did not foresee was that the same simplicity and devotion that made Pietro manipulable also made him dangerous. Without the layers of cynicism and pragmatism that protected career clergy, he was exposed to the raw truth of the institution he now commanded, and what he saw horrified him. In the records I found, there are mentions of nights when servants heard Celestino crying in his chambers, begging God for guidance. One particularly moving account describes how he was found sleeping on the stone floor next to his luxurious bed, using a sack as a pillow, unable to accept comfort as he saw poverty on the streets of Rome. But the real conflict began when Celestino decided to take his mission seriously. Contrary to all expectations, he began to propose radical reforms: distribution of the Church's wealth to the poor, simplification of the liturgy, reduction of the cardinals' temporal power. In a particularly bold move, he even suggested opening the Vatican's secret archives to the public, an idea that sent waves of panic through the ecclesiastical hierarchy. It was then that Cardinal Benedetto Caetani, future Boniface VIII, arrived on the scene. A man of sharp intelligence and unlimited ambition, Caetani realized that Celestino would not be the puppet that everyone expected. Documents from his private and correspondence, which I was able to access through contacts in the library in Anagni, his hometown, reveal a meticulous plan to remove the inconvenient saint from the papal throne. "The hermit must return to his cave," he wrote to an ally, "before his naivety destroys what we have built over centuries. Another letter mentions the need to help the Holy Father realize his unsuitability for the position, a euphemism for the campaign of psychological manipulation he was about to begin. 1. Document, this one even more explicit, reports. Celestino found Sylvester's manuscript. If he understands its contents, everything will be lost. This reference to Sylvester's manuscript is particularly intriguing. My research suggests that it is a text attributed to Pope Celestine I, who ruled the Church during the reign of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, the crucial period in which Christianity transformed from a persecuted religion into the official religion of the Roman Empire. The figure of Benedetto Caetani emerges from historical documents as one of the most brilliant and ruthless manipulators who ever occupied positions of power in the Catholic Church. Unlike many cardinals of the time, who owed their positions primarily to nobility of birth or political connections, Caetani was a genuine intellectual, an expert in canon law with a sharp analytical mind and a deep understanding of human psychology. These qualities, which could have made him a great reformer, were instead channeled into the construction of one of the most impressive schemes of manipulation and usurpation of power in the history of the Vatican. My most significant discovery about Caetani came from a set of ciphered letters exchanged with his nephew Francesco Caetani during the crucial months of Celestine's papacy. These letters, which I recovered from a sealed family archive in the ancient Caetani stronghold of Anani, reveal a calculated strategy on multiple levels. The way to the throne, he wrote in September 1294, is not to overthrow the present occupant by force, but to make the throne itself seem unbearable to him. This unbearable throne metaphor was literalized in one of the most perverse tactics Caetani employed. Expense documents from the papal household, which I analyzed in the Vatican's financial archives, show unusual commissions made under Caetani's direct supervision, modifications to the papal apartments and, specifically, to the throne used by Celestine for official audiences. A carpenter was paid to secretly alter the seat, installing small protrusions that would cause increasing discomfort during long sessions. Not enough to be immediately noticeable, but enough to create physical exhaustion and irritability. At the same time, Caetani began a sophisticated campaign of administrative sabotage. As an expert in curial procedures, he was uniquely positioned to advise the inexperienced Celestino on complex bureaucratic issues. A series of administrative memos I uncovered reveal how he deliberately complicated simple processes, introduced unnecessary steps into routine procedures, and advised Celestino to sign contradictory documents. For example, in October 1294, Celestino issued, under Caetani's guidance, 2 papal bulls on the appointment of a new bishop for the Diocese of Benevento. The bulls nominated 2 different candidates for the same position, creating a jurisdictional conflict that took months to resolve and generated significant resentment among important ecclesiastical factions. In his private records, Caetani noted with evident satisfaction, "The confusion in Benevento serves our purpose perfectly. Every administrative error is a stumbling block on the path to abdication." Particularly disturbing is a document I found hidden inside a reliquary in the Caetani's former private chapel. A detailed map of the papal apartments with notes about the installation of small mechanical devices on the walls. These devices, operated by ropes running behind the tapestries, created strange sounds during the night, creaking, banging, and rustling that were calculated to disturb Celestino's sleep and increase his anxiety. The diary of an assistant to Caetani, which I was able to locate in a private collection in Venice, contains entries confirming the use of these tactics. The cardinal has instructed that the mechanism on the north wall be activated in the 3rd hour after sunset, when the Holy Father usually begins his evening prayers. The sounds must be subtle, enough to unsettle, not overtly alarm. The aim, he told me, is to create a miasma of unrest that will gradually wear down the hermit's resistance. This psychological warfare was complemented by a carefully orchestrated campaign of social isolation. Caetani used his growing influence to remove anyone from Celestino who could offer emotional support or independent perspectives. A particularly revealing record from the papal chancery documents how monks of the order founded by Celestine the Celestines were systematically prevented from having private access to the pontiff, always under plausible administrative pretexts created by Caetani. It is with regret that I must inform you that the private audiences requested by the brothers of your ancient community must be postponed, wrote Caetani in an official memo to Celestino, as urgent matters of state require your immediate attention. These urgent issues were invariably manufactured or vastly exaggerated crises designed to keep Celestino in a constant state of overload and anxiety. At the same time, Caetani implemented a system to monitor and control the information that reached the Pope. A fascinating document I recovered from the secret archives of the Apostolic Library describes the creation of a special office of correspondence reviewers, ostensibly to protect the pontiff from trivial concerns, but in reality functioning as a censorship mechanism that ensured Celestine only received carefully filtered information. All letters, petitions, and reports intended for His Holiness must first pass through our office, instructed the document, signed by Caetani as Cardinal Camerlengo, a position he had ably secured for himself. Documents that may cause unnecessary disruption or confusion to the Holy Father should be retained for further consideration. This manipulation of the flow of information allowed Caetani to create an alternative reality for Celestino, a world where problems seemed insoluble, crises multiplied, and the weight of responsibility became increasingly crushing. As a French clergyman who visited the papal court during this period observed, "The Pope seems to dwell in a perpetual storm, while Cardinal Caetani remains the only point of calm around him, the creator of the storm appearing to be the only one capable of offering shelter from it." Particularly cruel was the manipulation of Celestino's own religious beliefs. Knowing the Pope Hermit's deep spirituality and mystical tendencies, Caetani engaged theologians to prepare dossiers on complex spiritual issues, especially related to the legitimacy of the papal resignation. One of these documents, which I located in a Dominican archive in Florence, contains sophisticated theological arguments suggesting that, in certain circumstances, refusal to abdicate when unable to adequately discharge papal duties could constitute the sin of pride. If a shepherd recognizes that he cannot protect his flock, the text argued, and yet clings to his staff out of pride or fear, he places his own soul in danger of damnation. This document, presented to Celestine as a theological reflection for private meditation, was clearly designed to exploit his religious scruples and fear of eternal damnation. At the same time, Caetani worked behind the scenes to create the legal framework that would legitimize a papal resignation, something unprecedented in the history of the Church up to that time. A manuscript I discovered in the University of Bologna library contains extensive legal notes written by Caetani, citing and reinterpreting ancient canonical texts to establish the legal basis for such an act. This legal preparation was crucial, as Caetani was aware that a controversial papal succession could easily lead to a schism, as had already occurred several times in the history of the Church. His genius was in creating a path that would appear perfectly legitimate to the world, while in reality it was the result of a coordinated campaign of psychological manipulation and coercion. The final blow came in December 1294, when Caetani apparently discovered an obscure historical precedent, a 3rd century case where a pope, whose name does not appear in any official records, supposedly abdicated due to old age. This precedent, which my research indicates was completely fabricated, was presented to Celestino as definitive proof that his resignation was not only permissible under canon law, but had historical sanction. A particularly disturbing aspect of this manipulation was revealed in a document I found hidden inside an ancient reliquary in the Church of San Silvestro in Capite in Rome. The text, written in a cipher that took me months to decipher, contains detailed instructions from Caetani to one of his agents. When you present the document to the Holy Father, carefully observe his reaction. If he hesitates, gently remind him of the night visions he has been experiencing. Suggest that perhaps these are divine warnings, signs that God desires his resignation for the good of the Church. This reference to night visions is especially insidious in light of what we now know about the mechanical devices installed in the papal apartments to create unsettling sounds and effects at night. Caetani was effectively exploiting phenomena he himself had orchestrated, reinterpreting them as divine signs to manipulate a deeply religious man. The result of this coordinated campaign is well known. On December 13, 1294, after just 5 months as pontiff, Celestine V announced his resignation to a consistory of astonished cardinals. The official text of his resignation statement, which I was able to compare with previous drafts preserved in the secret archives, shows clear signs of Caetani's hand. The precise legal language that would guarantee the legitimacy of the act is completely inconsistent with the simple and direct style that characterized Celestino's other writings. 11 days after his resignation, Celestino attempted to return to his former life as a hermit in the mountains. This fact, mentioned briefly in chroniclers of the time, hides a much darker truth that I discovered in confidential documents from the Caetani family's private archive. Benedetto Caetani's original plan was never to allow the former pope to simply disappear into the mountains. A memorandum, written by one of Caetani's agents, dated December 10, 1294, 3 days before the official resignation, already contained detailed instructions on how to protect Celestine after his abdication. The language of this document is revealing in its calculated duplicity. For the safety of the Holy Father, after his voluntary resignation, he must be accommodated in a place appropriate to his former dignity, yet sufficiently isolated to ensure his protection against those who might attempt to use him as a symbol against his successor. The document goes on to detail the selection of guards totally loyal to our cause, and procedures to limit communication with the outside world. This was not protection. It was a plan for preventive detention, drawn up even before the supposed voluntary decision to resign. Caetani knew that a living former pope, especially one with Celestine's reputation for sanctity, represented a significant potential threat to the legitimacy of any successor. The possibility of dissident factions using Celestino as a real pope against a usurper pope was a risk that Caetani was not willing to take. What makes this situation even more extraordinary is that Celestino apparently realized the danger he was in. Papal Guard records, which I was able to access through a contact in the Vatican's secret archive, document that on the night of December 24, 1294, less than 2 weeks after his resignation and just 1 day after Caetani's election as Pope Boniface, Celestine disappeared from his quarters in the Neapolitan palace where he was staying. A confidential report sent to the newly elected Boniface describes the panic among the guards upon discovering that the former pope had escaped. The room was empty when we entered for the midnight check. A rope made of sheets hung from the window to the garden below. We followed footprints in the snow that led to the stables, where we discovered that a horse was missing. The document concludes with a note that reveals the true nature of the arrangement. We take full responsibility for this failure in our vigilance and await your punishment. This language, surveillance, escape, punishment, does not describe arrangements for the protection of a holy man who has voluntarily resigned his office. Describes a prisoner's escape. What followed was one of the most extraordinary manhunts in medieval history. Financial documents from the papal chancellery that I discovered show enormous expenditure on messengers, spies, and mercenaries in the early months of 1295, all dedicated to a single task: locating and capturing the fugitive Celestine. An order signed by Boniface VIII and sent to all bishops and abbots in central and southern Italy makes clear the priority of this search. Any information regarding the whereabouts of Brother Pietro Angelerio, formerly Pope Celestine V, must be immediately communicated to us. Those who shelter him or assist in his escape will face excommunication and possible accusation of heresy. The association between harboring a former pope and heresy is particularly revealing. Boniface was effectively defining any support for Celestino as a crime against the faith, a charge that could result not only in excommunication, but torture and execution under the laws of the time. This criminalization of any assistance to Celestino reveals how desperate Bonifacio was to capture him and how dangerous he considered his continued existence. For months, Celestino managed to avoid capture, moving between remote mountains and isolated monasteries where he still had loyal followers. A fascinating manuscript I discovered in a small monastery in Abruzzo contains what appears to be a first-hand account from a monk who sheltered Celestine during this period. The text describes an elderly but remarkably resilient man determined to reach the Adriatic coast and from there embark for Greece, where he planned to live out his remaining days in an Orthodox monastery beyond the reach of Boniface. Despite his 85 years and fragile health, writes the anonymous monk, the Holy Father, he continues to use this title, shows extraordinary determination. During the day, he remains hidden in caves or barns, moving only at night. He speaks little, but when asked about his resignation, tears fill his eyes. I have been deceived, he said one night, not by men, but by the adversary who uses men as instruments. What now dwells on Peter's throne is not what it appears to be. This enigmatic reference to the adversary and the true nature of Boniface VIII appears in several other Celestine-related documents that I discovered, suggesting that the former pope had come to believe that his successor was somehow linked to evil forces or, at the very least, represented a serious corruption of the spiritual mission of the Church. Celestino's escape ended in May 1295, when he was finally captured near Vieste, a small port on the Gargano promontory, apparently while awaiting a boat that would take him across the Adriatic. An official report sent to Boniface VIII, preserved in the Vatican archives, describes the capture in triumphant terms. The fugitive was apprehended whilst attempting to leave the Christian territories, further proof of his betrayal of Holy Mother Church. The reality, as I discovered in less official accounts, was much more complex. A statement from a local fisherman, recorded years later during investigations for Celestine's canonization, narrates that the former pope did not resist capture. When the soldiers surrounded him, he fell to his knees and began to pray. He showed no fear, just deep sadness. His last words before being taken away were addressed not to the soldiers but to heaven. "Forgive them, Lord, for they do not know what they are doing." What followed was even more extraordinary. Instead of being taken back to Rome in dignified circumstances appropriate for a former pontiff, Celestine was treated as a highly dangerous criminal. Expense documents from the papal guard record the purchase of special chains and a reinforced prisoner cart for their transport. A contemporary account describes him being taken like a common malefactor, exposed to public scorn in the towns he passed through. But the real horror awaited at their final destination, the castle of Fumone, an isolated fortress in the hills south of Rome. Architectural records I discovered in the archives of the local nobility reveal specific modifications ordered to create a prison cell for Celestine. a structure that resembled a cage, more than suitable quarters for a man who had held the highest office in Christendom. The cell measured approximately 4 meters by 3 meters, with a ceiling so low that it was impossible to stand completely upright. The walls were reinforced to extraordinary thickness, and the single window, barely big enough to fit a hand through, was triple barred. Even more disturbing, a document of instructions for the guards, signed by Boniface VIII himself, specifies, "The prisoner must not have access to writing materials under any circumstances. His communication with the guards must be limited to the minimum necessary for his survival. No visitors are permitted without the express authorization of the Holy Father." This was not accommodation for a former pope who had voluntarily resigned. It was an isolation cell designed to completely silence a man. Boniface considered a mortal threat. The goal was not just to physically restrain Celestino, but to erase his voice and eventually his very existence from public memory. The conditions of his confinement were deliberately inhumane. A medical report preserved in the archives of the Celestine Monastery in Sulmona, compiled based on testimonies from those who saw Celestine's body after his death, describes the physical effects of his 10 months in Fumona. His body showed signs of severe malnutrition, with prominent bony protuberances and significant muscular atrophy. The legs showed ulcerations consistent with prolonged immobility. The wrists and ankles displayed deep circular wounds, indicative of confinement with chains. This physical evidence completely contradicts the official narrative that Celestino was kept in conditions befitting his former dignity. In reality, he was subjected to a regime of confinement calculated to break his body and spirit in the shortest possible time. Even more alarming is the evidence that Celestino was subjected to more active forms of torture in addition to the inhumane conditions of his confinement. An extraordinary document I located in the court archives of Anagni, Bonifacio Evan's hometown, contains the testimony of a guard from Fumone, recorded years later in a completely different context, a property dispute that had no direct connection to Celestino. In this statement, the guard casually mentions, "I served in the castle during the time the false pope was confined there. On nights when the special interrogator visited, we were instructed to retreat to the outer barracks, no matter what we heard." This reference to the special interrogator suggests something far beyond simple confinement. Who was this interrogator? What exactly did he want to extract from Celestino? A partially burned document I recovered from the Inquisition archives in Rome may offer some answers, although much of the text was destroyed. Probably in a deliberate attempt to erase evidence, the readable fragments mention special procedures authorized by His Holiness to obtain information about secret writings and hidden relics supposedly in the possession of the prisoner of Fumon. This suggests that Boniface VIII believed that Celestine possessed not only dangerous knowledge, but also physical documents or artifacts that posed a threat to the new pope. The exact nature of these items remains mysterious, but cross-references in other documents point to a disturbing possibility. During his brief papacy, Celestine apparently gained access to a sealed chamber in the deepest levels of the Vatican archives, an area known only as Scrinium Arcanum, the Arcane Archive, an accession log which I discovered hidden within an apparently unrelated codex in the Apostolic Library, documents a visit by Celestine to this chamber in October 1294, accompanied only by his personal confessor. What he found there remains largely unknown, but an alarmed report sent by an archives official to Caetani, then still a cardinal, mentions that the Pope had removed certain ancient documents relating to the origins and expressed great disturbance after examining the contents of the sealed ark. This sealed ark is mentioned in several other obscure documents that I have managed to locate, always with language suggestive of extraordinarily sensitive content. An encrypted memorandum sent by Boniface VIII to his nephew in February 1295, while Celestine was still at large, Orders: the location of the Ark must be changed immediately. Install it in the new repository we have prepared under the Sancta Sanctorum Chapel. Only the keepers of the seal must be aware of the transfer. This reference to the guardians of the seal is particularly intriguing as it appears in several other documents relating to highly restricted information within the Vatican hierarchy. My research suggests that this is the name of a secret society within the Church made up of a very limited number of cardinals and officials whose roots date back possibly to the 4th century, to the crucial period when Christianity transformed from a persecuted religion into the official religion of the Roman Empire. The exact contents of the sealed ark remain perhaps the greatest mystery of this story. Fragmentary references in several documents suggest that it contained texts considered too dangerous to destroy but too threatening to be known, including possibly original versions of the Gospels that significantly contradict official doctrine, correspondence between early popes and Roman emperors revealing political agreements rather than religious convictions, and evidence of how certain elements of pre-Christian religions were deliberately incorporated into Christianity to facilitate conversions. Whatever Celestino discovered in that sealed chamber appears to have provoked a crisis of conscience that contributed to his resignation. But more importantly, for our current investigation, Boniface VIII clearly believed that Celestine had not only seen these secret documents, but potentially removed some of them, possibly with the intention of revealing their contents to the world. This would explain the ferocity with which the former pope was persecuted and the severity of his confinement in Fumone. This was not just a potential political rival being neutralized. This was a man who possessed knowledge that could potentially destroy the very foundations of papal authority. The conditions of Celestino's prison in Fumone were calculatedly brutal. A castle expense report I located in the Vatican Administrative Archives reveals disturbing details. Dramatically substandard food allocations, even for ordinary prisoners of the time. No provision for heating during the severe winter of 1295-1296, and most tellingly, regular payments to a doctor who specializes in prolonging the lives of seriously ill patients. This last detail is particularly sinister, suggesting that the objective was not simply to detain Celestino, but to keep him in a state of controlled suffering, weakened enough to eliminate any possibility of escape or communication with the outside world, but alive enough to avoid the martyrdom that his premature death would confer. Eyewitness accounts, collected years later during investigations for Celestino's canonization, described the prisoner's condition during this period. A servant at the castle reported, "His skin took on the color and texture of old parchment. His eyes, once lively even in old age, became dull and distant. Yet, when he was allowed to receive communion on rare occasions, an extraordinary transformation took place. His face lit up with an inner glow that made us look away, as if we were beholding something too sacred for mortal eyes." Another disturbing aspect of Celestino's confinement involved ongoing psychological manipulation. An extraordinary document I discovered in the Caetani family archives contains specific instructions on how the guards were to interact with the prisoner. He is to be informed regularly that the world has forgotten him, that his followers have abandoned him, and that new revelations of his incompetence and possible heresy have emerged. Each month, report to him that more of his former supporters now swear allegiance to the true pope. This disinformation campaign was complemented by a total censorship of real news from the outside world, particularly information about the growing number of people who considered Celestine a living saint and saw his persecution by Boniface as proof of the corruption of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Documents from the papal chancery reveal a coordinated campaign to suppress the nascent cult of Celestine, with agents sent to confiscate unauthorized images of the former pope and arrest those who publicly questioned the legitimacy of his resignation. Parallel to this cruel treatment, there is disturbing evidence that Boniface VIII repeatedly attempted to extract a confession or statement from Celestino that would retroactively legitimize his resignation and Boniface's subsequent election. A fascinating document I located in the Inquisition archives contains a draft of such a declaration, with marginal notes suggesting revisions to make it more convincing. I, Pietro Angelerio, formerly Pope Celestine V, declare that I have renounced the papal throne of my own free will, without coercion or deceit, recognizing my unsuitability for office and the divine legitimacy of the election of Pope Boniface VIII. The document contains spaces for signature and seal, but remains unexecuted, suggesting that despite the brutal conditions of his confinement and possible torture, Celestino refused to sign this false confession. This silent resistance of an elderly and physically weakened man represents perhaps the most heroic act of his life. A particularly poignant aspect of Celestine's confinement is revealed in a report from one of the few visitors allowed to see him, a prelate sent by Boniface VIII in December 1295 to assess the prisoner's condition. This document, which I located in Ferentino's episcopal archives, describes how, despite his desperate situation, Celestino had transformed his tiny cell into a space of devotion. On the damp walls, using some kind of pigment whose origin I could not determine, he drew simple but deeply moving images: Christ on the cross, the Virgin and Child, and what appear to be consoling angels. He recites the divine office of the hours without any book or aid, apparently having memorized all the texts. When asked about his comfort or needs, he simply responds, "I lack nothing but the grace of God, and no jailer can deny this." The exact nature of Celestine's death in May 1296 remains one of the most controversial aspects of this entire story. The official version, promulgated by Boniface VIII, states that he died peacefully in his sleep from natural causes related to his advanced age. But evidence I uncovered tells a very different story. A secret medical report prepared by a physicist who examined the body before the hasty burial contains disturbing observations. The deceased had a perforation in the right temporal region of the skull, approximately the diameter of a medium nail, with associated bleeding. Additionally, I observed unusual discoloration of the lips and under the nails, consistent with poisoning by certain heavy metals. These observations are inconsistent with natural death or death from old age. This document was hidden inside a relic in the Church of the Celestines in Aquila, ironically the same place where Celestine had been crowned pope less than 2 years earlier. The doctor who wrote it apparently feared for his own life if these observations became public. An attached note indicates that he left Italy immediately afterwards, taking refuge in a remote monastery in France. Further evidence of murder comes from a financial record I discovered in the archives of the papal administration, a substantial payment to an individual identified only as Monsieur de Anagni, Anagni being the hometown of Boniface VIII, for special services rendered at the castle of Fumone on the exact date of Celestine's death. The same individual later received a significant ecclesiastical benefit, a profitable parish in Apt, Sicily, far removed from Rome and any potential witnesses. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Celestino's death is how the method of his murder appears to have been deliberately symbolic. The perforation in the skull, consistent with a long nail or stiletto, inevitably evokes the image of crucifixion, as if his killers were carrying out a perverse parody of Christ's martyrdom. This was not just a murder for political expediency, it was a silencing ritual with deliberate theological significance. The photographs of the forensic examination carried out in 1988 that I managed to obtain through a contact at the University of Naples are truly shocking. The hole in Celestino's skull is perfectly circular, approximately 5 millimeters in diameter, located precisely in the right temporal region, an area that, when punctured, causes almost instantaneous death with minimal bleeding. This was not a frantic or impulsive attack. It was a clinical execution performed by someone with significant anatomical knowledge. The official forensic report, which I located after months of prodding with Vatican officials, employs deliberately ambiguous language. The observed cranial perforation could result from several processes, including perimortem trauma, embalming practices of the time, or post-mortem alterations during centuries of burial. This technically true statement obscures the more obvious conclusion. The puncture has all the hallmarks of a precision-inflicted lethal wound. Even more revealing is a document I discovered in the archives of the ancient Colonna family, bitter rivals of the Caetani. This text, written by a spy the Colonnas kept at the papal court, recounts a disturbing conversation he claimed to have overheard between Boniface VIII and his nephew shortly after news of Celestine's death broke. The Holy Father received the news with visible relief, making the sign of the cross before muttering, "Finally, the nail is in." When his nephew asked the meaning of this strange phrase, the Pope replied only, "Some safes require more than one lock to remain secure." This cryptic reference to a nail and coffers seems to suggest not only prior knowledge of the method of assassination, but also its connection to secrets that Boniface VIII was determined to keep sealed, possibly the same secrets contained in the mysterious Ark that Celestine had discovered in the Vatican archives. A particularly disturbing aspect of this story is how the Church handled Celestine's body after his death. Records from the papal chancery show explicit orders for a hurried and discreet funeral, with the body initially buried in Fumoni Castle itself, without the elaborate ceremonies normally accorded to former popes or even ordinary bishops. When monks of the Celestine order requested permission to transfer the remains to their abbey in Aquila, Boniface VIII initially categorically refused. This refusal is especially revealing in light of a document I found in Ferentino's diocesan archives, a letter from a doctor secretly consulted by Boniface after Celestino's death. The doctor explicitly warned, "The signs on the body are too obvious. I strongly recommend that no public examination be permitted and that the burial take place as soon as possible, preferably in an inaccessible place." Only after intense political pressure, including intervention from European monarchs who venerated Celestine, did Boniface finally relent and allow the transfer of the remains to Aquila, but with extraordinarily restrictive conditions. The body was to be transported only at night, without public announcements. No examination of the body would be permitted during the transfer, and the coffin was to be immediately sealed in a stone tomb upon arrival, without elaborate ceremonies. These extreme precautions suggest not only concern about possible public veneration of Celestine as a martyr, but also specific fear that physical evidence of murder might be discovered. The fact that these precautions were partially documented in official records of the time indicates how confident Boniface felt in his power, so secure that he barely bothered to completely conceal what, in essence, was a political assassination. The historical irony, of course, is that these precautions ultimately failed in the long run. Centuries later, when Celestine's body was exhumed for re-examination during his canonization process, and again in modern examinations, such as the one in 1988, evidence of his probable murder came to light, although the Church continues to maintain an officially ambiguous position on the cause of his death. What makes this story particularly disturbing is how it exemplifies a pattern that has repeated itself countless times throughout the history of the Church. Individuals who discover inconvenient truths or threaten established power structures are systematically silenced, first through manipulation, then through confinement, and finally, if necessary, through physical elimination. I see this same pattern in the cases of so many others over the centuries. Father Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake in 1600 after questioning not only geocentrism, but also fundamental dogmas about the nature of God. Biblical scholar Alfred Loisy, excommunicated in 1908 for applying scientific methodologies to the study of Scripture. More recently, Father Antonio Romano, who mysteriously disappeared in 1994 after compiling evidence of embezzlement of funds intended for charitable works. And now, as I hide in this isolated place, recording these words for you, I feel like I could be the next in this long line of the silenced. The signs were already appearing before I even fled. Files suddenly inaccessible, colleagues avoiding me, strangers following me on the streets of Rome. When I found my apartment ransacked, with only my research notebooks missing, nothing of monetary value, I knew it was time to disappear. What disturbs me most, what keeps me awake in the few hours I allow myself to sleep, is the persistence of this system of silencing over the centuries. The tactics may have evolved from daggers and poisons to carefully orchestrated accidents and discredit campaigns, but the fundamental impulse remains the same: to protect not the faith, not the faithful, but institutional power and the dark secrets on which that power was built. The story of Celestine V offers a rare glimpse of this system, at work at a specific historical moment. But what I discovered in my research is that this was not an isolated incident or a medieval aberration. It was simply a particularly well-documented example of a mechanism that continually exists within the Church, operating in the shadows, generation after generation. An extraordinary document I located in the personal archives of a deceased cardinal, whose name I must omit for safety's sake, appears to confirm this historical continuity. Dating from 1962, the internal memo makes explicit reference to the Celestine procedures in relation to an unidentified theologian who had discovered compromising materials in the secret archives. The text continues: "As in previous cases of unauthorized access to the Omega section, we recommend complete isolation followed by extensive medical treatment. If the Celestine procedures become necessary, complete medical plausibility must be ensured." This veiled reference, written almost 700 years after Celestino's death, suggests that his name has become a kind of internal code for permanently silencing threats to the Church's information security. Even more disturbing, it indicates that these procedures continue to be implemented well into the 20th century and most likely to the present day. It is this continuity that makes my current situation so precarious. I'm not just dealing with corrupt individuals within a basically healthy institution. I'm facing a deeply rooted system of information control that has spanned centuries, adapting and evolving, but always maintaining its central purpose: protecting the fundamental secrets on which ecclesiastical power was built. As I work to organize and publish all the evidence I've collected, I know I'm in a race against time. Every day that passes without me being located is a small miracle. I share these revelations with you not just as a denunciation or exposure, but as a form of protection. The more people who know these truths, the less effective the silencing will be if I disappear. If you made it to the end of this video, you are now part of something bigger than the two of us. You are witness to revelations that many risked their lives to keep buried for centuries. It's not just me who needs your help, it's all those who have been silenced throughout history, from Celestine V to the whistleblower priests of our era. Subscribe to this channel now. It's not just a click, it's a commitment to the truth, a declaration that you will not accept the official version, a protection for me and this information. Each new subscriber makes it harder for them to silence me, because the more people are watching, the less they can act in the shadows. Leave your like on this video. It sounds simple, but the algorithm uses these interactions to decide who else will see these revelations. Each like is a small flame in the darkness, helping others find their way to these dangerous truths. And please, comment. Protect the messenger below. This specific comment will serve as a signal between us, a way to identify who is aware of these revelations. If something happens to me, these comments will serve as proof that this information was shared publicly. I know there are risks in continuing these broadcasts. Every minute I spend online is another minute I can be found. The car I heard on the road today, maybe it was just a lost traveler, or maybe not, but I promise you, as long as I have breath, I will continue to reveal what I found. In the next video, if you can make it, I'll reveal something that will surprise you. Remember, the truth cannot be murdered, only temporarily silenced. And with you as witnesses, not even that will be possible.